The old billionaire gasped for breath, his vision blurring as chaos erupted around him, until a woman in a white coat stepped forward, her face eerily familiar. It was a night like any other at the grand ballroom of the Empire Hotel, a place where the world's elite gathered under shimmering chandeliers. Billionaire Conrad Sterling, the man who owned half the city, sat at the center table, his presence commanding respect. He had spent his life building an empire, crushing competitors, and making headlines. But tonight, the headlines would be different. He raised his glass for a toast, surrounded by men in tailored suits and women draped in diamonds. Laughter echoed across the room, the kind only the powerful could afford. But as he brought the glass to his lips, his fingers trembled. A sharp pain shot through his chest, spreading like wildfire. His vision blurred. The world around him tilted. A choking sound escaped his throat. The laughter stopped. A woman gasped. Someone shouted for help. Conrad Sterling, the untouchable billionaire, was collapsing in front of his guests. "Call an ambulance!" A panicked voice rang out. Waiters rushed to his side, but no one knew what to do. His face turned pale, his breathing shallow. This was it. The man who had conquered the world was slipping away, powerless. Then a voice cut through the chaos, firm, unshaken. "Move aside!" A woman in a white coat stepped forward, her long dark hair tied back, her eyes sharp with focus. She knelt beside him, fingers pressing against his pulse. "He's in cardiac arrest. We don't have time to wait for an ambulance." Conrad's eyes fluttered open just enough to see her face, and something about her jolted a memory buried deep in his past. That voice. Those eyes. But before he could grasp it, darkness swallowed him whole. The woman wasted no time. With precise movements, she unbuttoned his tuxedo, placing her hands firmly on his chest. "We need to restart his heart, now." A businessman in the crowd hesitated. "Who are you to—" "I'm Dr. Elena Carter," she snapped, "and I'm the only chance he's got." Without waiting for permission, she began chest compressions. The billionaire's body jerked with each push. The murmurs in the room grew louder. This was the man who had ruled with an iron fist, and now a stranger held his life in her hands. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, sweat forming on her forehead. "Stay with me." The seconds dragged. The whispers turned to panic. If Conrad Sterling died here, the world would talk about it for years. But then... A gasp. A cough. His body twitched. His eyelids fluttered. A sharp inhale tore through his chest. He was alive. Barely. A relieved murmur rippled through the crowd, but Elena didn't relax. She leaned closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You don't remember me, do you?" A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Before he could respond, paramedics burst into the room. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Conrad's heart pounded, not from the attack, but from the creeping realization that the woman who had just saved his life wasn't a stranger at all. Conrad Sterling lay on the hospital bed, the steady beep of machines filling the silence. His body felt weak, his mind foggy, but one thought cut through the haze. Her. The woman who had saved him. Those eyes, that voice. He knew her. But from where? A knock at the door broke his thoughts. The doctor from the ballroom, Dr. Elena Carter, stepped in, her expression unreadable. She held a clipboard, her movements calm, professional. But there was something in the way she looked at him. Something deeper than just a doctor checking on a patient. "You gave us a scare, Mr. Sterling," she said, setting the clipboard down. "Your heart stopped for exactly 28 seconds. If it had been any longer, you wouldn't be here right now." He studied her, his mind grasping at the memory teasing the edges of his thoughts. "I know you," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, weaker than he'd ever heard it. "Who are you?" For a moment she just stared. Then she pulled up a chair beside his bed and folded her hands in her lap. 30 years ago, she began, her voice quieter now. A little girl sat outside a fancy restaurant, shivering in the cold, watching the rich eat like kings while she hadn't had a meal in days. Conrad's stomach clenched. She had no parents, no home, just a torn dress and shoes that barely fit. But she saw a man walk out of that restaurant, a man who looked like he had everything. She thought, maybe if she asked him for help, just maybe, he'd show some kindness. The air in the room grew heavier. Conrad felt his pulse quicken, but he said nothing. Elena leaned forward slightly. So she ran up to him. She tugged on his sleeve, looked up with the biggest, most desperate eyes, and said 4 words. "Sir, I'm so hungry." His breath hitched. "Do you remember what that man did?" she asked, her eyes dark with something unreadable. Conrad swallowed hard. His lips parted, but no words came out. "You do, don't you?" Elena whispered, her voice edged with something colder now. "You shoved her aside, like she was nothing. You told her to find a job and walked away. That little girl watched you disappear into your car, leaving her alone in the freezing night." Silence. Conrad's fingers curled into the hospital sheet. His mind raced, dragging him back to a night he had long since forgotten. Or maybe he had chosen to forget. Elena leaned back, crossing her arms. That girl, she didn't beg again after that. She decided she'd never rely on anyone. She fought, she survived, and she worked her way to the top. Her lips curled into a humorless smile. And now, the man who once turned his back on her, owes his life to her. A chill ran down Conrad's spine. He had built empires, destroyed competitors, buried his past under mountains of wealth. But it had come back for him. And it was standing right in front of him. Conrad Sterling felt something he hadn't in decades. Powerless. His fortune, his influence, his empire, none of it mattered in this moment. He was just an old man lying in a hospital bed, staring into the eyes of a woman whose life he had once dismissed like a speck of dust on his perfectly tailored suit. His throat was dry. His mind screamed for a response, a defense, an excuse. But deep down, he knew there was none. He had been that man, cold, ruthless, unforgiving. "I dot." His voice cracked, weaker than he'd ever heard it. "I didn't what?" Elena cut in, her eyes sharp. "Didn't think I mattered? Didn't remember? Or didn't care?" Conrad inhaled shakily. For the first time, he couldn't control the situation. He couldn't throw money at the problem, couldn't make it disappear with one phone call. The past had caught up with him, and this time, he was the one at someone else's mercy. Elena stood, her white coat swaying as she stepped closer to his bed. "You know what the funny thing is, Mr. Sterling," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I didn't save you because I wanted to. I saved you because I took an oath. Because I'm a doctor. Because I believe in saving lives, even the ones that don't deserve it." Her words hit harder than he expected. "You had everything that night," she continued, voice tight. "A warm coat, expensive shoes, a car waiting just for you. And I had nothing. And yet I saved you." Conrad swallowed hard, a foreign, sinking feeling twisting in his gut. Guilt. A word that had never existed in his world. Elena exhaled and straightened. "But don't worry, Mr. Sterling. I'm not here for revenge. I don't need an apology." She grabbed the clipboard, scribbled something, and set it back down. "Because at the end of the day, I don't have to live with the weight of what happened that night. You do." With that, she turned and walked to the door. "Wait." His voice was barely above a whisper, but she stopped. Slowly, she glanced back over her shoulder, her face unreadable. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the sheets. I want to help." Elena let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Help," she repeated, shaking her head. "You think money can fix this? Conrad's jaw clenched. He had spent his entire life fixing things with money. "Not just money," he said, forcing the words out. "Tell me how I can make this right." For the first time, her expression softened, not with kindness, but with something that almost looked like pity. "You can't," she said simply. "Some things can't be undone." She turned away again, gripping the door handle. "Rest up, Mr. Sterling. You're lucky to be alive." Then she was gone. Conrad Sterling, the man who had always been in control, was left alone with the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding, his conscience. The room felt colder after she left. Conrad Sterling stared at the ceiling, his mind trapped in a place he never allowed it to go. The past. He had spent his life moving forward, never looking back. But now the past had walked into his life, pressed down on his chest, and forced him to face the man he had been. Sleep didn't come that night. Not even when the nurses dimmed the lights and the city outside quieted. His mind replayed that moment outside the restaurant. The little girl tugging at his sleeve, her voice trembling as she asked for food, and him, brushing her aside like she was nothing. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling up, not at her, at himself. He had spent decades justifying every cruel decision, every ruthless business move, convincing himself that the world belonged to the strong, that the weak were meant to be left behind. But that little girl had survived, and she had done more than survive. She had risen. By morning, Conrad had made a decision. When the nurse came in to check his vitals, he cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter, I need to see her. Now." The nurse hesitated. "She's off duty, sir. Would you like me to leave a message?" "No," he said firmly. "I'll wait." Hours passed. He refused to leave, refused to be discharged. He needed to see her again. By late afternoon, the door finally opened. Elena stepped inside, arms crossed. "I thought we were done here, Mr. Sterling." He exhaled, gathering his words carefully. "Number, we're not." He motioned toward the chair beside him. "Please." She hesitated before sitting down, watching him with wary eyes. "You were right," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't remember every person I ignored, every life I stepped over to build my fortune. But I remember you now, and I can't change what I did. But I can change what I do next." She didn't say anything, just listened. "I spent my whole life believing power meant winning, that kindness was weakness," he continued. "But I was wrong. The strongest person in this room isn't me. It's you." Elena's jaw tightened slightly, but she stayed silent. "I don't want to throw money at this," he said. "I want to do something real. I have power, connections, resources. Let me use them to make a difference. With you." She raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you expect from me?" "Nothing," he said, "except the chance to learn, to be better." For the first time, her expression softened, just a little. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "If you're serious," she finally said, "then prove it. Not with words, not with a check, but with action." Conrad nodded. "Tell me where to start." Elena exhaled, leaning back. Then slowly she pulled out her phone, scrolled for a second, and turned the screen toward him. It was a list: hospitals, shelters, underfunded clinics. "Start here," she said simply. "Let's see if you really mean it." Conrad took the phone, reading over the names, feeling something shift inside him. For the first time in his life, his next move wouldn't be about profits or power. It would be about something bigger than himself. As Elena stood to leave, she paused at the door and glanced back. "You know, Mr. Sterling," she said, a small smirk playing at her lips, "you might not be a completely lost cause after all." For the first time in decades, Conrad Sterling smiled. Not because he had won, but because for the first time he was finally doing something that mattered.